Fred Henley vanished from Beacon Point Lighthouse during Hurricane Isabel in September 2008. 15 years later, renovation workers discover a hidden room containing 47 personal items that don't belong to him. The sledgehammer hit the lighthouse wall with a satisfying crack, sending chunks of century-old mortar skittering across the floor. Danny Reeves wiped sweat from his forehead and examined the progress his crew had made on the lighthouse restoration project. It was March 2023, and after years of bureaucratic delays, the Coast Guard had finally approved the conversion of Beacon Point Lighthouse into a maritime museum. "Danny, you need to see this," called Maria Santos from across the curved interior wall. She was the project foreman, a meticulous woman who'd restored historic buildings up and down the Atlantic coast. Her voice carried an unusual note of confusion. Danny set down his sledgehammer and walked over to where Maria stood, examining what should have been solid stone. Instead, her flashlight revealed a gap behind the mortar, a space that shouldn't exist in the lighthouse's original blueprints. "Looks like there's a room back here," Maria said, running her fingers along the edge of what appeared to be a carefully concealed entrance. "The mortar's different, too. Newer, maybe 30 years old, instead of 150. Danny pulled out his phone and called the project supervisor. Within an hour, a structural engineer had confirmed what they suspected. Someone had deliberately sealed off a section of the lighthouse, creating a hidden chamber approximately 8 feet by 12 feet. More intriguingly, the renovation had been done professionally with proper ventilation and moisture control. When they finally broke through the false wall, what they found inside defied explanation. The room was immaculate, as if frozen in time. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding an eclectic collection of items that had no business being in a lighthouse. Expensive electronics from the 1990s and early 2000s. Sealed packages of what looked like prescription medications. Detailed maritime charts with routes marked in red ink. And most puzzling of all, 47 personal items, each tagged with a date and location. Among the personal effects were a child's teddy bear, a wedding ring, a police officer's badge from Philadelphia, a woman's purse containing identification for someone named Maggie Tillman, and dozens of other items that clearly belonged to different people. Each was carefully cataloged and preserved, as if they held some significant meaning. Maria photographed everything before calling the authorities. The collection raised immediate questions about Fred Henley, the lighthouse keeper who disappeared during Hurricane Isabel 15 years earlier. The official investigation had concluded that Fred had been swept away while trying to secure equipment during the storm. His body was never found, which wasn't unusual given the violent seas that night. But this hidden room suggested a very different story. The storm had hit Beacon Point on September 18, 2008, with winds reaching 95 miles per hour. Fred Henley had been the lighthouse keeper for 8 years, a solitary man in his 40s who lived alone in the keeper's quarters and maintained the automated beacon system. According to the original investigation, he'd radioed the Coast Guard at 8:47 p.m. to report that he was securing loose equipment. That was the last communication anyone had with him. Coast Guard rescue teams searched for 3 days after the storm passed, but found only scattered pieces of lighthouse equipment and Fred's rain jacket caught on the rocky shoreline. The assumption was that he'd been knocked into the churning waters while working outside and his body had been carried out to sea. His girlfriend at the time, Melissa Smith, had told investigators that Fred seemed nervous in the weeks before the storm. She'd attributed it to the approaching hurricane season and his responsibility for maintaining the lighthouse during dangerous weather. What she hadn't told them was that Fred had recently started talking about leaving his job, about finding work inland where they could start a family together. Melissa had been 3 months pregnant when Fred disappeared. The discovery of the hidden room brought Melissa back into the story 15 years later. Now, Melissa Smith Williams, married with 2 teenage children, she worked as a nurse at the regional medical center. When Detective Ray Sullivan contacted her about the new evidence, she agreed to meet at the Lighthouse. Standing in the hidden chamber for the first time, Melissa's composure cracked. "This isn't the Fred I knew," she said, examining the carefully organized contraband. He was quiet, honest. He loved this lighthouse, loved being alone with his books and his weather instruments. But as Detective Sullivan walked her through the evidence, a different picture emerged. The maritime charts showed routes between Beacon Point and various locations along the coast, some extending to the Caribbean. The dates on the personal items corresponded with missing persons reports from coastal towns throughout the region. Most disturbing were detailed logs, written in Fred's careful handwriting, documenting what appeared to be smuggling operations spanning several years. The logs revealed that Fred had been using the lighthouse as a coordination point for moving contraband during storms. When weather conditions were severe enough to keep Coast Guard patrols in port, boats would use the lighthouse beacon to navigate to hidden coves where cargo could be transferred. The personal items appeared to be trophies or evidence of people who'd crossed the smuggling operation. Melissa struggled to reconcile this evidence with her memories. "The Fred I knew read poetry," she said. "He'd spend hours watching seabirds through binoculars. He was gentle, patient. This feels like evidence of someone else's life." But the handwriting was unmistakably Fred's, confirmed by comparing it to lighthouse maintenance logs and personal letters Melissa had kept. More troubling were phone records the investigation team obtained, showing that Fred had been in regular contact with several individuals with criminal backgrounds in the months before his disappearance. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to examine the Lighthouse Foundation itself. If Fred had been involved in smuggling operations, there might be evidence of modified structures or hidden storage areas. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered an anomaly beneath the lighthouse's stone foundation. Excavation revealed a cavity that had been sealed with concrete sometime around 2008. Inside, wrapped in tarps and remarkably preserved by the cold, dry conditions, was Fred Henley's body. The autopsy revealed that Fred had been shot twice in the chest at close range. Based on the concrete's composition and the body's position, he'd been killed elsewhere and then buried in the foundation during the storm. The timing explained why no one had noticed the construction activity. All the noise and chaos would have been attributed to the hurricane. With Fred's body recovered, investigators could piece together the final chapter of his story. Phone records and financial documents revealed that he'd been planning to leave the smuggling operation in the weeks before Hurricane Isabel. Bank statements showed he'd been slowly moving money into accounts Melissa knew nothing about, amounts that suggested he'd been planning to relocate them both far from Beacon Point. But Fred's criminal partners had different plans. The investigation uncovered a network of smugglers who'd been using the lighthouse for years, moving everything from drugs to undocumented immigrants through the treacherous waters around Beacon Point. Fred's position as lighthouse keeper had made him invaluable to the operation, his legitimate presence at the remote location providing perfect cover for coordinating illegal activities. When Fred announced his intention to quit, especially while being in a position to expose the entire network, his partners saw him as a liability. They'd arranged to kill him during the storm, when his disappearance could be explained as a tragic accident. The hidden room had been sealed immediately afterward, preserving evidence of the operation while making it appear that Fred had simply been swept away by the hurricane. Phone intercepts revealed conversations between known smugglers in the days after Fred's disappearance, discussing the need to clean up loose ends and secure the operation. The lighthouse continued to be used sporadically for smuggling activities until 2019, when increased Coast Guard patrols made the location too risky. For Melissa, learning the truth brought a complex mix of emotions. The man she'd loved and grieved for 15 years had been living a double life, involved in criminal activities that had ultimately cost him his life. But she also learned that in his final weeks, he'd been trying to escape that life for her and their unborn child. "I miscarried 2 months after he disappeared," Melissa told Detective Sullivan. "I always wondered if the stress and grief contributed to it. Now I know he was trying to build a future for our family, even if he was going about it the wrong way." The personal items in the hidden room told stories of victims who'd crossed the smuggling network over the years. Maggie Tillman, whose purse was among the collection, had been a social worker who'd disappeared while investigating reports of undocumented workers being exploited at coastal farms. The police badge had belonged to Detective Frank Morrison, who'd vanished while following leads on drug smuggling through small maritime communities. Each item represented someone whose questions had gotten too close to the truth, people who'd been silenced to protect the operation. The teddy bear had belonged to a 7-year-old girl whose family had been killed when they'd witnessed a smuggling transfer. The wedding ring had been taken from a Coast Guard officer who'd started asking too many questions about unusual boat traffic. Fred had kept these trophies not as souvenirs, but as evidence. Hidden among the contraband logs were detailed notes about each victim, locations where bodies might be found, and information that could have exposed the entire network. He'd been documenting everything, perhaps planning to turn evidence over to authorities as part of his escape plan. The investigation that followed Fred's discovery led to arrests across 3 states. The smuggling network, which had operated for over 2 decades, was finally dismantled. Families who'd spent years wondering about missing relatives finally got answers, though the truth brought its own painful closure. Danny Reeves and his renovation crew completed their work on Beacon Point Lighthouse 6 months later. The building now serves as a maritime museum, but also as a memorial to the victims of the smuggling operation. A plaque near the entrance honors Fred Henley not as a criminal, but as someone who'd ultimately tried to do the right thing, even though it cost him his life. Melissa visits occasionally, standing in the lamp room where Fred once maintained the beacon. She brings her teenage son sometimes, telling him about the lighthouse keeper who'd loved poetry and seabirds, who'd watched storms approach from the sea with both fear and fascination. She doesn't tell him about the hidden room or the criminal network, not yet. Those are truths for when he's older, when he can understand how good people sometimes get caught up in situations that spiral beyond their control. The lighthouse beam still sweeps across the dark waters each night, no longer guiding smugglers to hidden coves, but serving its original purpose of warning ships away from the dangerous rocks that have claimed so many vessels over the years. The light that once concealed criminal activities now stands as a beacon of truth, illuminating secrets that had been buried for 15 years and bringing closure to families who'd never stopped looking for answers. In the end, Fred Henley's greatest crime may have been his silence, keeping secrets that could have saved lives if he'd spoken sooner. But his final act, documenting evidence of the network's victims, ensured that justice eventually prevailed. The 47 personal items that had seemed so mysterious to the renovation crew had actually been his attempt at redemption, a record of lives lost that he'd planned to present to authorities as part of his escape from the criminal world. The storm had taken Fred Henley's life, but it hadn't been able to bury the truth forever. Sometimes the lighthouse's beam still catches the attention of boats in distress, guiding them safely to shore, just as Fred had once hoped to guide himself and Melissa to a better life, far from the dangerous secrets that had ultimately consumed him.